So for those that don't know me, my name's Matthew Waters. I'm one of the Senior Technical Advisors for the Victorian Building Authority's Technical and Regulation Unit, building. So I'm here to deliver today's first part of the presentation, and I'll be focusing on the changes to the NCC that are relating to Volume 1. So we're talking about Class 2 to 9 buildings. So as mentioned, the session's broken up into two sessions. Session 1 will focus on Volume 1, and Session 2 will be focusing on the changes to Volume 2. As David mentioned, a lot of the changes we're going to discuss today have come out of Australian Building Codes Board projects, and they've really put an emphasis on quantifying the performance requirements. They've done this via either directly quantifying performance requirements, or they've sometimes tried to use verification methods. We're also going to discuss Victorian appendix matters when they come up, so obviously try to contextualise it to you guys and make sure that it's relevant. David also mentioned we've moved to a 3-year amendment cycle. The VBA is obviously very conscious of the fact that there's a lot of information to digest, being that it's a 3-year change. So on that, we're not going to touch on every single change that's occurred today. We're just going to go through what the VBA thought's most relevant to most practitioners, and there is an emphasis that if you do anything that's not covered today, that you would undertake further research if required. As you walked in, you should have received a little handout which gives you some information about the changes, so it gives you a little brief overview. Just like I said, we're not going to touch through everything on that list, and it is a list you can find in the back of the NCC for those that are aware. We've just elaborated on some points where we thought we could have provided some more context. We'll also be taking questions at the end of the session. Really encourage everyone to get involved there, so please have some questions for us. And then the staff will be available, as David and Daryl indicated. So as most of us should be aware, the 2019 edition of the NCC came into force on the 1st of May this year. The important thing about this edition is some key transitional provisions that apply, and they're mainly surrounding energy efficiency. So the Section J from Volume 1, there's a 12-month transition, so you don't necessarily need to use 2019 until the 1st of May 2020. And the same thing occurs in Part 2.6, the performance requirements, and Part 3.12, the deemed to satisfy provisions of Volume 2. So something to be conscious of if you're a designer in the room, just to be aware of there are some important transitions that might impact you. So has anyone had an opportunity to open up the 2019 NCC and have a look? Bit of a show of hands. So a few. What about 2016? Anyone open 2016? So on the, there is a little bit of an expectation that people do understand basic concepts that are already contained in 2016. But we'll certainly be discussing a 2016 context now changing to 2019. Another key transitional provision is a delayed adoption of a new verification method. So as part of quantifying performance requirements, the ABCB have created a new fire safety verification method, which is in Schedule 7 of the code, and it's a verification method that can be used to demonstrate fire safety performance solutions comply with the performance requirements. So that's delayed until the 1st of May 2020 as well, and it's because there's some background data that they're waiting to publish and make sure it's right before they do so. So before we get into the Volume 1 changes, this change occurs over both volumes, and it's a transition that's provided to the AS 1530 series. So for those that don't know, this set of standards deals with fire testing for flammability, combustibility and fire resistance levels. So that changes from the 1st of May 2022 that you need to use the updated versions. So that might impact some manufacturers in the room. If there are any, you might need to make your products, have them retested, and for people in industry, you obviously need to make sure that you're using compliant test reports. So 1st of May 2022, just ensure you're using the relevant 1530 test reports that are in the code. So I've basically mentioned this already, but I'm going to focus on Volume 1 today. We're going to have the break, and then my colleague Kath's going to focus on Volume 2. I've already mentioned that a lot of the outcomes of 2019 NCC come out of ABCB projects, and they've really tried to quantify performance, so we'll certainly discuss that. Some of the most important things this year are new provisions that deal with condensation management. This is over volume 1 and 2, and it's the first time that it's been considered by the code, so there's new performance requirements, verification methods, and deemed to satisfy provisions to put those provisions in. One of the biggest changes, probably the biggest, certainly from a metro context, is mandatory sprinkler protection in all class 2 and 3 buildings where they have a rise in stories of 4 or more, and they're under 25 metres in effective height. So pretty fundamental fire safety change there, and we'll discuss how those provisions impact you when that arises under Section E. So there are a few changes at the front end. So Section A, it's now called the governing requirements, it used to be called the general provisions. This is the first time that they've presented a common structure between all 3 volumes. So the first thing you might notice when you look at any volume of the code is they all contain the same information up the front end in Section A. And the ABCB have done this to improve readability. So if a practitioner works along with multiple volumes, they can pick up any. Section A is going to have the same volume, the same content. And that was really done by a stakeholder liaison and getting feedback. So we have a couple of tables on screen. The left shows Section A of 2016, the right shows Section A of 2019. You'll see that when you read the code, Section A is still containing the rules for complying and using the code. It still tells you what a performance solution is, tells you the compliance pathways, etc. They've just tried to simplify it over the 3 volumes. So there's been a pretty big change in Section A, which emphasises the mandatory nature of Section A, the governing requirements, and this occurs in the compliance framework. So when you've previously read the code, it simply says compliance with the NCC is achieved by complying with the performance requirements. In 2019, it's emphasising that compliance is achieved by complying with the performance requirements and governing requirements. So it's really saying that you can't ignore the governing requirements, they are a mandatory part of the code, and they have to be read in the context that they're intended. There's also been some clarity provided in the situations where you have a code and a reference document and what overrules. So certainly when I first started reading the code and studying, it was if there was a conflict, the code trumps the standard. Relatively simple concept in terms of the hierarchy of legislation. In 2019, that has changed a little bit in terms of if you use a reference document in its entirety, you no longer need to regard a conflict that's occurring. So it happens a lot in Volume 2. So if you were looking at footings and slabs, for instance, under Part 3.2, and you were using 2870 as your method of complying with the performance requirements, you wouldn't be considering any conflict that arises. So a little bit of a fundamental shift there, and it's really just putting up the validity of the reference documents as an acceptable construction manual in terms of complying with the code. They also use some mandatory limitation and exemption boxes, so they use these to separate concepts, makes the code a lot easier to read, and you can clearly see when you're reading something if it attracts a certain limitation or exemption. So I think they've done some good work on improving the readability of the code. Another new change is the introduction of schedules. So you'll notice that if you've read 2016, there used to be a lot of specifications contained in the front. So we've got a bit of another table situation on the screen. So we have left that shows 2016, right shows 2019. So there's a lot of information that was in specifications, and they've now removed these and they've put them in the back of the book and they've called them schedules. So the important thing to note here is that the content is largely the same. It's just a relocation. So Spec A 2.3 in 2016, which was used to determine the fire resistance level of a building element. It's just been moved to Schedule 5. So if you're opening the code for the first time, you're looking for that process of how to determine the FRL. You just need to be conscious that the location might have changed, but the concept is still the same. I've also got up there the fire safety verification method, which I mentioned earlier, and that's the Schedule 7. And that does have that delayed adoption until 1st of May 2020. So that gives you another fire engineering process that you can go through. So on to some changes of the provision. So the first one we're going to discuss is C1.9. So this is the provision that requires non-combustible building elements to be installed in certain locations the clause requires. So this came in with Amendment 1 of 2016, and it was really implemented to simplify when a non-combustible building element is required. So the first thing I need to mention here is the bonded laminate concession remains, so it's a valid pathway under 2019 NCC. They've also expanded the provisions, so they now have some more concessions for things that don't need to comply. So we're thinking about, they've added in sarking, for instance, so sarking in an external wall doesn't need to comply with non-combustible, so it doesn't need a 1530 Part 1 test report if it's not thicker than 1 millimetre and has a flammability index of no greater than 5. So a pretty good change there in terms of something that's commonly used in a building, and they've included it as a concession given the low risk associated with that. They've also included things like glazing, thermal breaks associated with glazing, and termite management systems. So they've expanded the concessions, and it was based on the fact that they're low risk. So something to be conscious of, mainly to probably building surveyors in the room. If you're used to getting 1530 Part 1 test reports, just be conscious that there are some concessions afforded to you in 2019. Now, I mentioned before that there's transition provisions provided in the code, so these are really given to allow industry enough time to adapt to changes. So if a manufacturer needs to retest the product, or industry need enough time to actually make a product that complies, they allow these transitional provisions. So in 2016, there was one that gave a transition for the determination of group numbers. So when you're looking at certain elements in the building, you need to have a group number determination in terms of fire hazard properties. And 2016 code had a transition that ended 1st of May 2019. It's not very obvious in 2019 because it was provided in 2016. It's not discussed again, but certainly something to be aware of is that you can no longer use test reports under previous editions of the code for compliance for 2019 for determining group numbers. So it requires a new standard to be used. It's AS 5637 Part 1, determination of fire hazard properties it's called. It still uses the old 3837 if a correlation exists between the specimen and a full-scale room test. But there's some more reporting parameters, so you need a bit of a more thorough report. So something to be aware of for mainly building surveyors, just to be conscious of the fact that their new reporting for group numbers needs to be determined in accordance with a new standard reference in the NCC. Another one they've added in, you can see on the screen, there's a timber-faced hollow core doors. So they've added in hollow core doors as the type of doors that don't need to comply with fire hazard properties. So previously the provision simply said fire doors, timber-faced fire doors, timber fire doors, or timber-faced solid core doors. So a door like shown on the screen, you would have needed fire hazard property compliance, so they've added that in as a concession, as this was the original intent of the provision. So they've, shown an ability to actually change provisions where it didn't align with intent. The ability to use timber in mid-rise construction came in 2016, and it was targeted at Class 2, 3 and 5 buildings, so apartment buildings, hotels and office buildings. So in 2019, they've expanded these provisions to now apply to all classes of building. So you can now build any class of building out of timber up to 25 metres in effective height. If you build over that, it's a performance solution, as the code would specify. Wood Solutions are a bit of an advocate for the timber industry, and they produce some pretty good guidelines on using timber and how to comply with the provisions. They currently have some available for 2s, 3s and 5s, and it's expected they'll expand these to other classes, so certainly something to be conscious of and look out for. There's basically been some amendments to the provisions to allow you to use the provisions on these other classes. So basically, the provisions ask for you to put cavity barriers in specified locations. It specifies a level of performance they must achieve and where they must be located. They've just expanded provisions so it actually aligns with other classes. So a Class 6 where you'd have a higher fire resistance level, they've added that in as an ability so you can comply. There's also some limitations with sprinkler systems that you can use, and I'll discuss them when we discuss Section E. So on screen we have a bit of a diagram. This is taken from the Wood Solutions guideline for Class 2s and 3s buildings. Basically it's a junction between a fire-rated floor and a fire-rated internal bounding wall of a Class 2 building. You can see on the picture, or I hope you can, but basically there's a cavity barrier in the middle, and it's mineral wool in this case. What the specification does is it will indicate what that has to be, where it has to be located, and the level of performance it needs to meet. So mineral wool is one avenue of complying. Another one you could do is you could use a bit of timber that this specification tells you how big it needs to be in the stress grade, or you could use 1530 Part 4 test report that demonstrates something complies. So that's the type of information that the spec really covers. We've really shown this not because it's new, because it was in 2016, but it's because it's now could be applied to a larger amount of classes of building. So something to be aware of if you're dealing with, Class 6 and they want to use timber. Clause C3.15 deals with service penetration, so it's looking at service penetrations where you have penetrations through building elements that need to have a fire resistance level or a resistance to the incipient spread of fire. In 2016, the clause required it to be identical to a tested prototype, so you basically had to install 100% in accordance with the tested prototype. If you varied at all, performance solution territory. In 2019, they've identified that this is a real contrast to determining an FRL, which permits you to vary in a minor degree or differ in a minor degree, subject to getting a test report from an accredited testing lab. So they've aligned these provisions that you can now differ from a prototype, so long as you have a report from an accredited testing lab. So something to be aware of. Really good change from my view, because it now, you wouldn't need to go through the performance solution process for something that's relatively simple, and you've had it verified that it still complies. So it references a new standard there. It's AS 4072 Part 1, and it deals with service penetrations, and it tells you the report that needs to be prepared and who can prepare that report. So it's expected that it'll be done by someone who is experienced in testing similar reports and similar products, and providing reports. So the key takeaway there is you can now differ from a prototype. You just have to meet some certain requirements. I mentioned earlier that there's a big push against verification methods, or push to verification methods. The ABCB really do this where they can't directly quantify performance, and where it's quite difficult to actually quantify a performance requirement, identifying that some you just can't put a value on. So there's two new verification methods for access, so DV2 and DV3. DV2 is a verification method you can use for modelling whole of building access, and essentially what you do with this is you model a deemed to satisfy compliant building, so it complies with disability requirements. You baseline the level of access that's provided, and then you vary that depending on what you wanted to do in the building. You remodel it, and then if you have greater access than the building you modelled, compliance is verified. So a bit of another pathway there you can use. It's a performance solution, obviously, but certainly something that can be used. DV3, on the other hand, is used for complying with a ramp, so it's used to demonstrating the compliance of a ramp with performance requirement DP2, which deals with ramps. It really looks at the pushing force required for someone to ascend and descend the ramp, the braking force, and the time taken to go up and down the ramp. So there's some calculations you need to do. We didn't put them on the screen because it looks like some Galileo theory, but there is an ability to use calculations to demonstrate compliance of a ramp, which would be different than your 1 in 14 typical. The VBA weren't really aware that there was a bit of contention with how you'd apply the code to this situation that we have on screen. So apparently the ABCB advised us that there was some confusion in industry about how you measure the distance between, the maximum distance between alternative exits. So on the screen we have a bit of an example which shows a building, and it has a room in the top left corner. It's got a point of choice which someone can take where they have access to 2 exits. So let's just say they're fire-isolated stairways for the exercise. We were told that some people, when measuring maximum distance, would measure along the bottom corridor, and others would measure back through the point of choice and then back down. So if we think about the exit provisions, there's minimum distance between exits, maximum. If you did the bottom corridor, you'd essentially get the same result for 2 distances, which doesn't really make sense, but apparently people were doing that. So they've issued some wording change with these provisions to clear this up. So basically they've added in, for the purpose of D1.5C, which is the relevant provision, and then it's indicating that when you measure the maximum distance, you must go back through the point of choice. So please do that with 2019 if you weren't already. And another example of the ABCB looking at improving clauses where alleged confusion exists. Another new change is clause D221. Victoria have a variation for this provision. It's basically dealing with children's services. However, it's not impacted by these new provisions, so I'll digress. So this was an outcome of a proposal for change that was put to the Australian Building Codes Board. So just to talk about this quickly, there is a process that's called proposal for change that people can go through to propose a change for the NCC. Most people aren't aware of it, but you can go on the ABCB website, you download a form, you basically outline what the issue is, you give some background about who you consulted with, what the impacts of it will be, and it's considered by the ABCB, and then potentially it gets inputted into the code. So we get a lot of people who, whinge about aspects of the code. It's obviously not perfect. It's a very complicated document, a very good complicated document, and important to understand that if you do have issues that you find in your day-to-day activities, you can propose a change. So this is one of them. So someone proposed a change to this provision, and it was really for the situation where you have a manual operation to a door that's not located on the door leaf itself. So talking about on a wall predominantly, but it's not located on the door leaf. So they've brought in some provisions where you can have it off the door leaf, subject to meeting certain parameters, so it specifies where it must be located. So it can't be located 500 millimetres from an internal corner. And it's really looking at disability access requirements and what someone in a wheelchair would need to use that. It's also got control mechanisms, so it specifies a push button of a certain diameter, and you can do that in lieu of having something on the door leaf. So something that's changed there. And there's also braille and tactile signage requirements that come into play. There's been some general changes to Part D3. So this is the disability provisions, and there was a review of the access to premises building standards, which is shown on the screen, and they found that there was some change required to certain provisions of the code. So clause D3.5, which has been in for a while, basically says if you have up to 5 car parking spaces, you don't have to have signage. They've issued some clarification around that. Apparently it wasn't very clear and people were misinterpreting it, but they've issued some clarity to say that you need not identify a car parking space for disability if there's no more than 5. So that is certainly the provision and the intent of the provision. So it's something to be conscious of. They've also brought in a new clause which deals with the dome buttons which are provided for aged care facilities. So in lieu of having tactile ground surface indicators at the end of a ramp, you can have a dome button, which is basically just a little button on the handrail, and you can do that in lieu of tactile ground surface indicators for aged care facilities only, and it's considering that they have a specific need. I'm a big fan of this one, and I think from a quantifying performance requirement perspective, it really shows the effort the ABCB have gone into quantifying. So it was previously relatively difficult to determine where a fire brigade was available to attend a building fire. My background's working for a state fire service, and we consistently gave advice that we can get anywhere. Some situations that probably wasn't accurate. But they basically amended this clause to put a distance provision in for when you attract a hydrant system. So they basically said that if you have a fire brigade station that's within 50 kilometres of a building, you have to put hydrants in. If it's outside that distance, you don't need to put hydrants in, so you wouldn't put a hydrant system. So probably not going to affect anyone in the metro, but certainly if you do any country work, you'd need to verify the distance from the building to the fire station. If that's more than 50, you wouldn't need to provide hydrant protection in accordance with AS 2419 Part 1. So something to be conscious of. In a lot of those situations where they're remote, they require pumps and tanks due to poor water supply or water pressure and flows. So a really positive change there. So it's 50 k's along roads, so certainly a check that needs to occur. The second provision with this is that even if you're within 50 k's, the station that's within that distance still needs to have capability to attend a structure fire. So probably a conversation to be had, probably with the CFA, as it would mostly impact, just to say, do you have capability? And the other thing, it also applies to farm buildings under H3.9. So if you have a farm building, the same parameter applies, 50 k's. If it's outside that, no fire hydrant protection is required. So I think that's a relatively good one in terms of quantifying. The second one on this is fire hydrant boosters. So they've introduced a new provision that basically gives you a concession for fire hydrant boosters. And this was a result of the ABCB looking at performance solutions that are used nationally and whether they can be incorporated into the code as a deemed to satisfy provision. So the first one is, if you think about the provisions of AS 2419, which where booster assemblies come in, they can either be in the wall of a building, has to be protected, or they can't be within 10 metres of the building. So there's some key parameters there. The two new concessions are, if you sprinkler protect a building, you get exempt from all protection requirements for a booster. So you don't need to you don't need to protect your booster with a fire-rated wall, basically. So you can have an unprotected booster assembly. The second one is if you want your booster located between 3.5 and 10 metres, you can do so, subject to having a wall behind it with a fire resistance level. So for those that are aware, there's similar provisions already in the standard for hydrants, but they only deal with hydrants, so they've now expanded them. So another thing where you would previously have done a performance solution, got a fire engineer involved, a lot of time and effort, so they've taken that out and they've now put in some DTS, so another good shift there. They deleted fire hose reels in Class 2 and 3 buildings some time ago. Most of you would probably know that it was part of risk assessments done and that occupants typically wouldn't use a fire hose reel, they'd egress the building. So the ABCB expanded that research to look at other classes of building to see if they could apply these same concessions to other classes. So they looked at Class 5 office buildings, and it's resulted in a deletion of the requirement for fire hose reels for office buildings. So you no longer need fire hose reels in offices, you just need to provide extinguishers for Class A fire risks. So something to be aware of if you do many offices. And the reason is that employers are typically telling staff to exit the building as opposed to hanging around. So another shift there. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is really about some key changes around fire safety provisions, and they've brought in the new provisions for Class 2 and 3 buildings. So 4 or more stories, mandatory sprinkler protection in some form under the deemed to satisfy provisions. So deemed to satisfy is pretty important there. So there were previously options which were similar. So you could install, in Victoria, you could install sprinklers under our variation, which was H103.1, and you could attract certain concessions, so you could extend travel distance, amongst other things. And they've put this in as a DTS nationally. So the key first thing is that Class 2 and 3 is up 4 or more stories, under 25 metres effective height, mandatory sprinkler protection. And then it's got a new specification, E1.5A, which gives some new provisions for how these systems can operate. So we've got a bit of a flow chart on the screen, which you can hopefully see. So it's kind of going through a decision-making process that you'd go through when you're determining what your building requires. So if you're below if you're above 25 metres in effective height, you need a 2118 system. It's pretty explicit. If you are below 25 metres in effective height, then your next consideration is the rise of stories of the building, and then that's dictating what system you need to provide. So if you're below 25, you can use 2118 series, so part 1, which is general systems, part 4, which is accommodation buildings, and part 6, which is a combined hydrant sprinkler system. And you may note that if you're in the provisions for these new standards, so 4 or more stories, there's some new documents which are called technical specifications published by the FBAA, so they're in the bottom middle one there, and we'll talk about them now briefly. So basically they've given you 2 new options for a sprinkler system. It's FPA 101D, which is a drinking water supply system, so it taps in off the drinking water supply. The second one is an FPA 101H, and it's tapping in off the hydrant water supply. So these are published by the Fire Protection Association Australia, and they were developed in consultation with some research done by Fire and Rescue New South Wales, and they're obviously less stringent than a 2118 system, but they're cost effective for the purpose they're used for, so they're considered to be relevant to these relatively low rise and story buildings. So the important thing I need to stress here is they're not used by themselves. So what they do is they vary elements of 2118. So they use a 2118 system, and then they vary specific provisions so they can tap into the hydrant or drinking water supply. And another important thing with this is Victoria's maintained the requirement to sprinkler protect balconies regardless of size. So if you know about 2118, you're only required to sprinkler protect a balcony when it exceeds a certain square meterage and depth. Victoria varies out of that, so you have to sprinkler protect a covered balcony. So in relation to these 2 new tech specs, there's basically some provisions that outline where they can be used, and we've basically shown it on screen, but you can see that in mixed class situations, you can rarely use the drinking water supply standard, so the FBA 101D, and the hydrant water supply is relatively similar. It's very limited in scope when you start mixing in other classes of building. So that's really because they're lower grade than a standard 2118 system and less reliable. So something to be conscious of in terms of understanding how you need to apply them. Now, as they've imposed this new provision of providing sprinklers, you do get some concessions. So there is some silver lining from a buildability perspective. So although you now need to put in sprinklers in these buildings, you do get concessions. The concessions are based on the stringency of the system. So for a 2118 system, which is the bee's knees, you basically get quite a lot of concessions. So you get the most concessions, and then as you go into the FPAA ones, you get less and less. They give you concessions for things like reduced fire resistance levels, protection of openings, so you don't need to protect openings, and extended travel distances. So things that would typically be performance solutions for these buildings previously. If you had a building that was 4 stories and you want to extend travel distance and do other things, you might have put sprinklers in. So it's really just giving these to you as of right under deemed to satisfy. So something to be aware of. There's also been some changes to lift installation. So for those that deal with sprinkler protecting lifts, basically there's some new changes to do with lift installation. So previously lift installations, you had to have a dry type system. So the supply to the lifts had to be dry type. It couldn't be the wet type typical sprinkler system. They brought in some changes with 2019. So you can use a wet sprinkler system for a lift as long as you protect it for accidental damage. So you're putting a cage in, and you also need to make the system in a way that it can be isolated without isolating any other sprinkler in the building. So a couple of things to note there. There's also been some clarity around E2.2A and Spec E2.2A. So these deal with zone smoke control and when you need to consider a part of the building as a zone for the purpose of the provisions. So we've got a bit of an example on screen. It's Class 9A building. We pinched this from the Australian Building Codes Board as it was relatively good in what it's explaining. It's a building more than 25 metres in effective height, therefore it has the provision. And they've now clarified that, well, you can see it's a Class 9A building firstly, and it's separated into stories, and then in the bottom floor it's got 2 fire compartments next to each other, still Class 9A building. And what the new provisions have done is clarify that there are only different zones when they're one above each other, and to the side they're not considered zones for zone smoke control. So something to be conscious of there if you've been considering another way. The provisions were relatively clear already, but they have given some clarity there. The other change they've done with smoke hazard management is they've implemented a new clause. It's clause 5, and it deals with a situation where you get a Class 2 or 3 building and it's got a combined detector alarm system, which is really typical in them types of buildings. Previously, what you'd have to do is you'd have to look at the individual clauses and figure out what the system had to look like. They've now combined them in one clause, and it's really easy to understand the type of system that you have to provide. So clause 5 of E 2.2 gives you some parameters around that. This is a pretty big shift, and one that is something that Australia can be relatively proud of, I think. So there's some new provisions that deal with, so it's F2.9, so a new clause, and it deals with accessible facilities for adults who have profound or severe disabilities. So this concept's been around for some time. You might have heard it thrown around in media or other things as changing places. It's really looking at providing a facility that can be used by someone who has a disability that's not covered by the existing provisions in the building code. So prior to the introduction of these provisions, people with severe disabilities were really limited in terms of where they could travel. They were obviously limited to where they could go due to the disability they had, and they had personal care needs. The positive thing is that there's been a really big voluntary uptake of putting these facilities in buildings already. So government and private have both been very aware of this, and they've been putting them in buildings. So the first thing I need to make sure about the provisions is that they only apply to pretty large public buildings. So looking at sports stadium with more than 35,000 people as a design occupancy. You're looking at shops, so Class 6s with more than one SOU, so you can't have just a sole occupancy unit for those that don't know, but you can't have more than, it needs to have more than one sole occupancy unit to trigger the provisions, and then that has to have an occupancy of 3,500 people. So you're really looking at very large public type buildings where people typically go. In terms of applying the provisions, there's only ever one required in a building, has to be unisex, and it can't be counted towards other facilities, so it has to be its own standalone facility. If you want to put another one in, so if you want to put 2 in, it is up to you what you want to do with the second one, how you want to arrange that in terms of exclusivity to a sex, for instance. So we've got a little bit of a video that we're going to show, which gives some background into the provisions, and it gives some context into the impact they can make. So it goes for about 3 minutes. We'll play it, and then I'll come back and talk about the specifics of the provisions.
Rachel is our daughter. She's 16 years old. She's got cerebral palsy and so needs to use a wheelchair. She goes to Glen Allen School in Glen Waverley, and she loves going to school. And she's got 2 very good best friends, and we've just had this, Chloe and Chelsea. And we've just had school holidays, and we've spent a fair bit of time with Chloe and Chelsea. We've been to the movies and we did a cooking day. One
of the challenges out of Rachel being a little bit older now is actually taking to the toilet. Prior, when she was younger, we were able to actually lift her to the toilet.
I've noticed how difficult and challenging it actually is for Mum and Dad, and that's really affected us because we can't do certain things anymore.
Lifting her is actually it's hard for Rachel, and it's actually quite hard for us, and we've always got the constant threat of actually hurting ourselves. So one of the things is always, am I going to hurt my back?
Because we can't access the toilet easily, we have to time it, not give her too much to drink before we go, and then wait till we get home before she can go to the toilet again. So the alternative might be putting an incontinence pad on.
Having changing places has really opened up our options and has meant that we can actually be a normal family, go to the zoo, for example, where we are today, and know that if there is a need that we need to go to the toilet, we can in a dignified and safe manner.
A changing places facility is different to a wheelchair accessible toilet because it's got a ceiling hoist, which means we can get Rachel into her sling. If we need, there's a changing table there that goes up and down, which we need to change her in some way, or we can just lower her straight onto the toilet using the hoist. It's a bigger space, so you can have more than one carer in there, which we need with Rachel, and there's room on both sides of the toilet, so you can have your carers standing on both sides of the toilet just to hold the person.
The advantages and features of the Peninsula toilet allows carers to go either side of the toilet. It works perfectly with the hoist and the mechanism of the hoist coming from the ceiling straight onto the toilet. It just makes that whole process very clean and safe for the person using it.
A lot of the people that would use these toilets wouldn't have much upper body strength, so you're able to stand there with her easily rather than leaning over her from the front, which is a lot of accessible toilets are like that.
A disabled toilet at the moment isn't really fully catering to the needs, and by simply having a hoist in those areas makes the world of difference.
It was such a relief that we could come, it didn't matter how long we were here, we could take Rachel to the toilet whenever she needed to. All we had to do was bring our own sling, so we can come back anytime knowing that we can easily go to the toilet.
It would make her quality of life even better. It would make ours even better because we get to see the enjoyment through her eyes.
My mum had a places, so I go to places.
So some context there about these provisions and the type of person they're targeted to, and got a little bit of background about the differences in opposed to a disability that's severe and then one that the code already talks about. So they mentioned some of the provisions already, and the first thing that the specification does is it requires a hoist and change table. So it's got a key difference than a standard accessible facility. They're both shown on the screen at the moment in the picture. So the parameters here is that the hoist has to be an XY gantry type hoist, needs to get full access to the whole room, so you can't have any area of the room that it can't get access to. And it has a safe working load limit, so it's 180 kilos, has to be capable of holding 180 kilos, and that is the same as the change table. So it's also the new change table provisions, has to be installed with one long edge against the wall, and then that 180 kilo limit comes in. So a bit of a shift there, and you can certainly see it on the screen. The other thing is they have to have operating instructions in the facility, so it needs to indicate how you operate the hoist and the change table. It needs to be just basically signed somewhere, so something to be conscious of. The next one, we've got on screen a 1428 Part 1 compliant existing facility. So these are the ones that the code already deals with under the deemed to satisfy. And the right, we have a accessible adult change facility. So basically, we heard from Rachel and her family for a bit, but they talked about that she has no upper body strength. And if you think about a traditional accessible facility, it's really relying on someone facilitating their own transfer, and they have the ability to do that. So these provisions identify that that's not suitable for someone with a severe or profound disability, therefore there's a new provision. So we've got the Peninsula style toilet, which is shown on the right, and it basically has to be located in the middle as opposed to against a corner, which is a standard facility. There's grab rails to the side, and a key difference here is they have to be able to be moved. So if you think about someone's going to the change table, using the hoist to get access to the pan, the carers really need to be able to remove the handrails and then put them back in. So that's what the provisions are really looking at doing. So hopefully that's giving you some context and background, and certainly probably presents some difficulties in terms of if you were trying to performance that out of a building. some challenges you might have. 2019 NCC also does some new provisions about condensation management. So I mentioned this earlier, but basically it's only residential buildings, so you're looking at Class 2 buildings, so the sole occupancy units of a Class 2, not common areas, and Class 4 parts, which are your typical caretaker buildings. So the provisions basically require two things. They look at external walls complying, and you do that via either a pliable building membrane, which is a new defined term that means something that's tested to AS 4200 Part 1, and it's classed as a water barrier, so you'd need some test report to indicate that's compliant. In addition to that, in Victoria, we're in climate zone 6, 7 and 8, which is most of Victoria. It has to be vapour permeable, so it needs to permit vapour to pass through, and that's another parameter you'd need to be satisfied with that it complied. If you don't put a pliable building membrane in, you can still comply, you just need a drain cavity. So you either put a pliable building membrane in, if you don't do that, you drain your cavity and it complies. So that's the first thing, external wall compliance. The second part is ventilation. So it specifies certain spaces in the building. It's looking at sanitary compartments, bathrooms, laundries and kitchens. And it's saying where you put exhaust in one of these spaces, it tells you the flow rate of discharge requirement for that exhaust system and then the method of discharge. So basically, how can it be discharged? Can it go into the roof space or does it have to go directly outside? So if it can go into a roof space, it also gives some parameters about what that roof space needs to look like, how it has to be ventilated, so something to be aware of. There's also a new verification method which you can do some modelling to look at where condensation accumulates in the building and how you can mitigate the risks. So some new provisions there that are applicable to all residential buildings now and Class 4, which is residential. So certainly something for designers to be aware of in specifying products in walls that comply and building surveyors for checking and then the builders in making sure it's put in properly. There's a new part which is called G6 and it's dealing with occupiable outdoor areas, which are basically spaces that are on the building, they're confined by the confines of the building, and they're considered to require some requirement in terms of code compliance. So you're looking at things like rooftop bars, rooftop car parks, spaces like that, and it's giving you some parameters around how you apply the deemed to satisfy provisions of the code to these spaces. So we'll talk about it now, but basically I've got on screen a bit of a list of all the deemed to satisfy provisions that this new part references. And what this new provision does is it tells you how to apply the code to these parts. So one up there is about fire hazard properties. You get an exemption from smoke developed rate for this area, for instance, because it is open and the building code doesn't really care about smoke developing in that area. So it's really looking at what provisions of the code should be applied to this space and then specifying what that has to be. So some new provisions there for you to be conscious of. Section J, so there's been as most people will know, Section J is probably the biggest section that's changed with 2019. They've done a whole review of the full provisions, so they've looked at the performance requirements, they've looked at verification methods, deemed to satisfy provisions, and it is quite big, to be honest. So the first thing I'll mention is that there is that transition I mentioned earlier. So there is that 12-month transition where you have a choice to make, 2019 or 2016, what way would you like to comply? And then once you've made that choice, you obviously have to comply fully with that addition of the code, with the performance requirements. And then from the 1st of May 2020, you can only use the 2019 code. The ABCB are releasing a handbook on Section J. It's expected shortly. It's about 150 pages. I had the pleasure of reading it, and it is very detailed and gives you a lot of good information. So very much encourage everyone to have a look at that if you are interested. They're also expected to publish some new calculators for things like fans and pumps and artificial lighting, so that should be updated on the ABCB website. So we're firstly going to discuss a new verification method that's been put in, so performance solution under the building code. So it's JV1, it's a new VM that basically it allows the use of a National Australia Built Environment Rating System, so it's a rating system. It's called NABERS. It allows the use of basically modelling protocols to be applied to Class 5 office buildings. So you can use modelling and you can determine that your Class 5 office building complies. What it does is it looks at greenhouse gas emissions and it needs certain parameters to be met in terms of you to verify compliance. And it also requires a commitment agreement to be made between the owner or developer and NABERS. And basically it's a commitment, it's a contract, and it indicates that we will achieve a 5.5 star NABERS rating, and then if they don't achieve that, then there's some repercussions. So it is a fairly new one. It was previously used quite a bit under performance. You can log onto their website and see buildings that have used it and the star rating they get using it, so something to be conscious of. The second one we're going to discuss is JV2. It's another verification method, and it allows you to use something called Green Star, which is managed by the Green Building Council of Australia. It's used for Class 3 to 9 buildings and common areas of a Class 2, understanding that a normal Class 2 SOU will be subject to NatHERS. So you need to provide an energy model, and basically it's looking at the compliance of the building and certain greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to a deemed to satisfy compliant building. So you essentially rate the building and it looks at the reference building, it's called, and then if you have 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions that that building has with your proposed building, you verified compliance. So it's basically a 10% increase in performance from a emissions perspective, and you've verified that the building complies. So another option in terms of alternate to the deemed to satisfy provisions. Another big change which really deals with sole occupancy units in Class 2s and a 4 part of a building, so caretaker, is the use of, or the requirement to now consider independent heating and cooling loads. So most of you might be aware that previously you looked at a collective heating and cooling load limit, and then it gave you your star rating. In 2019, the NatHERS compliance pathway requires you to consider certain load limits for heating and cooling loads and to check if they've been exceeded. So as part of that, the ABCB have published this standard, which is shown on screen, and it basically gives you for climate zones, so NatHERS climate zones, not building code climate zones, but for different NatHERS climate zones, gives you heating and cooling load limits that can't be exceeded. So it'll be something that will need to be checked by the building surveyor in terms of issuing the building permit. And the good thing about this is that it's information already contained on the certificate that NatHERS provides, so, well, your energy assessor provides, but the NatHERS certificate. So it already spits it out on the main page, so it should be relatively simple for the building surveyor to quickly look at the report, verify the number, and then compare it against the ABCB standard that I showed previously. So that emphasis is on the RBS to make sure that that value hasn't been exceeded. And they still have to obviously check the collective value. They've also done some quantification around JP1, which is the performance requirement, and this has resulted in JP3, which was in 2016 being deleted, so a performance requirement in 2016 was deleted. So they've now incorporated an hourly regulated energy consumption for the building, and basically it's in the performance requirement. So if you tried to do a direct performance solution against the performance requirement, you'd need to provide some pretty good information to suggest that you met that limit. So you're probably thinking about reports, calculations. You'd probably want it peer reviewed, and then you could verify compliance. But it's set it into the performance requirement, so you'd need to consider it if you were doing a direct assessment. So it's relative to the building and its use as well, so more energy usage in a building is already considered. Another change is change to part J1. This deals with basically building fabric, so it looks at a whole of facade type approach in 2019. So previously you'd look at your external building fabric, and then you'd look at the glazing separately, and now it's requiring a holistic whole of facade approach. So you need to take a consideration to both elements and their performance and look at it as a whole system, given that's how it's installed. So that is relatively big, and parts from J2, which used to deal with glazing, are now in a new provision J1.5, but the overall premise is you need to do a whole assessment. The R value and total system U value also need to be calculated depending on the part of the building being considered. And most of you will be aware, but the previous editions of the code used to give you typical R values for different types of common construction methodology. That's no longer in there anymore, so every part has to be calculated in accordance with the standard that the code specifies. So another pretty big shift there. J3 deals with building ceiling, and the changes they've done here really relate to exhaust fans. So they've basically said any exhaust fan has to be fitted with a sealing device if it's in a conditioned space, regardless of what the fan is. So any exhaust fan has to comply. Another change here is where you have a conditioned space and you have a loading dock with a roller door. So it might be a class 6 or 7. If you have that situation, the roller door has to be a rapid roller door for building ceiling, so it's limiting heating and cooling loss, and it requires to move at a speed, so it's 0.5 metres per second parameter, and it's a new defined term that's been introduced, so something to be aware of if you deal with conditioned warehouses or shops that have spaces out the back, that needs to be considered under the new building ceiling parameters. Some other changes for J6, which deals with artificial lighting and power. So the first one is that where you have fire-isolated stairways, passageways, ramps, they need to be controlled by a motion detector. So artificial lighting in those spaces have to be controlled by a motion detector. So that's a bit of a shift. Another one is when you have exterior artificial lighting, so lighting outside the building, it only needs to be considered by the BCA where you have it on the facade of the building, so it's attached to the facade, or it's directly facing the facade, so it's facing out the facade. If it doesn't hit either of those things, so it's on a path or anything, it does not need to be considered by the deemed to satisfy provisions. They've also included some energy parameters surrounding lifts, walkways, and moving ramps. So basically, if you have one of these in the building and it's unused for 15 minutes, it specifies certain speeds that they all have to be reduced to. So it's all about saving energy use and reducing consumption. So something to be aware of. It is new. BCA has never considered these elements before, so something to be conscious of. Although I suspect most people will probably wait until 2020 when it becomes a mandatory requirement. This is the last thing we're going to talk about, but basically there's a new type of building that's been introduced in 2019. It's called a residential care building. For those of you who have dealt with these types of buildings before, Victoria has our own variation for this, and we've had it for some time. We've called it residential care building as well. So they basically take the age factor out of a Class 9C building. So it's acknowledging that you have occupant groups who still need a higher level of compliance, but they're not solely limited to the age. So it might be people with disability or young children who need a higher fire safety performance, and aged care didn't quite fit them, therefore they didn't have any parameter. So the important thing I need to say here is that Victoria's maintained our own definition. So we have our own definition. It's called residential care building, and it's got brackets after it and it says VIC. So it's pretty easy to see where it occurs. And you only use that definition when you're determining when a building needs sprinklers. So for E1.5, when you're considering if the building needs to be sprinklered, you're looking at the Victorian definition for residential care building VIC, and all other instances in the code where it's used, you're looking at the national definition. They're relatively similar, however, we contextualise ours to Victorian legislation. So we've got a bit of a table on the screen that's showing the different types of residential care buildings you may see. So sprinkler protection is already required in these buildings in Victoria, so you'd already have Class 3s, 9As and 9Cs that need sprinkler protection if they're built in Victoria. The other thing on this is that a 9C aged care building still remains, so it's still its own type of building. And when a clause requires something to be specifically applied to an aged care building, it says so in the provision, it's very explicit. So something to be aware of when you're reading it. Hasn't changed in terms of its application to aged care, it's just separating concepts so you actually understand when it's only intended to apply to aged care as opposed to any res care building.